I'm really happy that several people could make it this morning. So this is a paper that I've been working on with another person, Yoav Kenny, who is also a co-organizer of this conference. And I think I'd like to start with... No, I don't need it. I need it. Sorry. I'd like to start off with a rather kind of what I take to be a rather provocative assertion, namely that namely that in some cases governments should allow hunger strikers. Thank you. Hunger strikers to die and not force feed them. That is the kind of thesis that I want to forward today. This is a hard question. I've been in a little bit of touch with advocates, lawyers who have been working on this question representing hunger strikers. And I think it's a question that, from an advocacy perspective, it's really kind of difficult to answer. Even people who are strongly objecting the proposed bill to allow for force feeding, when they come up with the question, imagine that someone can either be force fed or die, and there's no option of release or negotiation with that person. What's preferable? And oftentimes the answer is I can't answer that question. I'm not going to answer that question. It puts me in too difficult a situation. And that kind of tendency not to answer, I believe, is symptomatic to the entire discussion about this. So, and I want to probe into that a little bit. So here are a few of the kind of normal arguments or ordinary standard arguments that we hear in this context. First, the governments who, the United States governments in particular, who is advancing and force-feeding prisoners in many of its prisons, not only in Guantanamo Bay, but also in federal and state prisons in the United States, is basically saying we have an obligation to protect human life. There is a kind of fiduciary relationship between the government and a prisoner that is created by being imprisoned. And during that time, we're going to do everything in order to get this person out of here alive. He or she may want to die after they're released, but during this period, it's a very difficult and intense, mentally and physically, problematic period for all these people, and we have an obligation to protect them. So think what you will. This is a kind of a strong argument, I think. And another argument that Shai alluded to is that actually force-feeding cannot be applied because it constitutes torture or inhuman and degrading treatment under the Convention Against Torture. This is another kind of moral basis for, obviously, rejection of this proposal. And the third, and probably the most strong form of argument that we heard in the context of the debate in Israel, as well as is very vocal in the United States, is an objection from the point of view of doctors or the medical profession. Here, the emphasis is on professional ethics. We, as doctors, are bound to the principle of informed consent. We cannot force feed a person that doesn't want to have treatment. So, but the problem is that no side in this debate takes full responsibility of the kind of practical consequences of their positions. And I'm going to kind of grossly divide this to the medical profession on the one hand and governments on the other hand. So governments, from their side, they seek the protection of a person's life, but they are largely dependent on the medical profession in order to achieve that goal. Why? Because they want to protect a person's life in a clean way that doesn't constitute torture, that doesn't exert excessive amounts of pain. And they also so they're dependent on the doctors that have their own ethical obligations. And by delegating this decision to doctors, they are not they're kind of concealing the political nature of their choice of doing this, of of force-feeding prisoners. On the other hand, doctors also, they seek control over the question when to use force feeding against patients, but when faced with the consequence that someone we're not going to force feed because it violates the principle of informed consent. When faced with the consequence that someone might die because of that, it also seems to be beyond the kind of scope of what their role is in that question, and they leave it to the government, and then the government can make its own decision. But there's something kind of partial about that. So, just to sum up until now, the arguments in this debate are framed in what I think of as seemingly equally binding, or at least compelling, moral intuitions, moral principles that are nonetheless incommensurable, that are nonetheless kind of they don't talk to one another, and they're kind of they have a divide between them that seems unbridgeable. And the challenge that we want to face with this paper is to try to bridge that gap. Try to give a theory of, I don't know if it's a grand theory, but it is a theory that will, I guess, add the missing link to this story. And what is missing in this story is, I think, the politics of hunger strikes, their understanding as a political phenomenon that needs to be understood in political terms. What do I mean by that? So it's kind of easy to understand what that means when it comes to the hunger strikers themselves. In the context of Israel-Palestine, we know that hunger strikes are sometimes contesting detainment or prison conditions, but they're also a symbol of resistance, of political resistance to the occupation, to military control, and they're in that way a symbol of political action. And these are a few cartoons that I just found online that kind of illustrate that. Here you see this person who's in a hunger strike, and his mouth becomes these arms that are closed together, and I think it's also a symbol of not speaking and not eating, and a kind of symbol of resistance. This is another similar cartoon in which kind of the resistance to food becomes a form of very kind of basic political violence that falls beneath the category of armed resistance, but nonetheless does perform an act of force, an act of resistance. And here, hunger strikes are understood as sumud, or the Palestinian category of kind of sumud is often associated with attachment to the land, but also just rejection of occupation and colonization and military control. This is fair enough. This is easy enough. It could be summed up in, I think, 4 different aspects of the phenomenology of the politics of the hunger strikes. First, the prisoners regain control over their body by not eating. They regain control over time and over creating an emergency in the prison by adjusting not eating to a particular span of days or months. If they take salts or liquids, for example, they can manipulate that amount of time. They control, I have 5 minutes, so quickly now. They can control to some extent means of communication in the prison, and they exercise collective organization. But the more tricky or interesting, I think, part is how does that hunger strike become political from the side of the government or from the side of the state? So here, I would like to say that the hunger strike and the objection to force feeding is related to a particular understanding of the social contract. I'll just explain that very quickly. social contract expects some form of consent or agreement between members of a particular political community. In the context of criminal procedure, we expect still in some, under a theory of social contract, in some level, the person who has been sentenced to somehow accept or somehow feel that the sentence is legitimate. And I don't say that they will like that sentence, of course. That would be silly or idiotic. But what I do say is that a kind of most rudimentary form of consent is the consent to remain alive, is the consent to not be kill yourself and kind of go through that process. And so what this means is that the hunger strikes becomes a kind of remedy of last resort, a political hunger strike. And here, this is the category that we propose, the category of the political hunger strike, as opposed to just self-starvation. When there is a danger that detention or that imprisonment becomes, in some ways, a fate that is worse than death, that form of remedy still remains available if no force feeding is allowed. And it's a kind of remedy of kind of civil disobedience, if you will, that reflects, on the one hand, some minimum level of dignity that the prisoner has as a life that is not only living but also has its own will. But on the other hand, as I said, a particular understanding of the political community, of those members who are bound by law, that still have a form of minimal, if you will, Hobbesian consent to the legitimacy of law. Okay, this is expressed in kind of simple terms when states talk about the reputational costs of prisoners dying in hunger strikes. Reputational costs mean that the state has to explain itself, has to give account to public community that is that gets the information about death in prison or somehow, and now becomes accountable. Now needs to address the perceived notion that it has killed its prisoners and not that they have killed themselves. Okay, so I'd like to wrap up here. And I think I kind of got the main idea through, but if we have discussion, and I realized that this was a little bit rushed, I would like to kind of try to develop these ideas a little bit more. Thank you.